That's right. You're watching Insights from Africa with me, Bronwyn Seaborn, and we're here at the Norval Foundation in Cape Town, South Africa, for the Africa Unlocked conference hosted by Standard Bank. And a lot of the discussions here are around Africa reclaiming its narrative. And I sat down with the CEO of Standard Bank, Sim Chabalala, to find out why now is crucial for Africa to do that. Let's take a look.
I think the uncertainty that is currently in existence can be understood in historical context. The period of globalization we're going through now is similar to the period of deglobalization between 1914, between sort of 1815 and 1914. And there are lessons to be learned about what happens during deglobalization. And we should learn those as Africans. That's one. In other words, trade routes change, trade patterns change, and one should learn to identify the opportunities that arise from that dislocation first. Secondly, the Pope that was appointed now is an Augustinian. St. Augustine of Hippo was an African. The third point is to say that economics associated with the growth in the demographic dividend, as well as the infrastructure that the world needs, regardless of what's happening. The world needs the copper, the cobalt, the manganese, and indeed the rare earth minerals that South Africa, Tanzania, Madagascar, and a couple of countries are rich in. And therefore, if you think about the infrastructure needed to have access to all of those resources, it provides massive opportunities. And things like the Africa Continental Free Trade Area are formal institutional processes that help us to take advantage of those opportunities. And today, this conference is just part of that. Work between small enterprises, government, philanthropies, thinking creatively about how to have access to these opportunities. So I hope that makes sense. I mean, it's an exciting time.
It does. And it's maybe about seeing through the noise, which is what you're saying, right?
See through, because remember, whenever there's volatility, it always reverts to the mean. And during the tough times, identify opportunities that you can exploit during the tough times and envision what it looks like post the tough times.
I guess it's also about shifting perceptions about the continent. We did have the Vice President of Botswana saying things this morning in his opening address that, we should move away from this idea of Africa needing to be saved. It needs to be seen as this platform of opportunity. It feels like a rather mammoth task, though, to change those perceptions. So where do we start?
We start by having conversations like we're having this morning. We start by looking at the real data. For example, aid as a proportion of the funding needed for activity on the continent is small. You saw that from the presentation made by Gulam, our economist. Trade is actually a large proportion thereof, but Africans don't trade enough between themselves. Why? Because of trade barriers, non-tariff barriers. Having identified those should be removed. In that context, in answer to your question, African leaders, whether they're in the private sector or the public sector, need to speak up at the appropriate fora, like today and other global forums.
Because
they need to speak up.
Speaking up and speaking out and putting those data points forward to say this is actually the African story, this is challenging the perceptions, because
yes,
all of that is to encourage investment, right?
Indeed. And the point here, Bronwyn, is on the one hand, you've got the great demographic. The largest of 1.4 billion people getting healthier, getting wealthier, more productive, more connected. Great opportunities for an entrepreneur in that context. Infrastructure, as I said, roads, bridges, ports, to get the minerals and the manufactured goods to the ports, fantastic opportunity. This morning, just to end off, we had a lovely story by a person involved in agriculture about the movement of apples from one part of South Africa to another part of Africa, and the process that went into that. So we need more of that, the intra-Africa trade.
And you highlight something really important there. You talk about entrepreneurs and we talk about small business. Is that still the growth driver in Africa? Because it's long been touted that that's where the job creation is. That's where we're really going to see a lot of exciting things happen. Do you think that is still the case, that it's small business entrepreneurs that is really pushing the continent forward?
I absolutely think so, Bronwyn. And again, the entrepreneurs here today and the conversations we're having with them prove that point. When you build the infrastructure that I'm referring to, the roads, the ports, the bridges, you need lots of activity in the value chain, which includes those entrepreneurs. And one plea we would make in this context is let's speed up the payment processes and not hold up payments to these entrepreneurs. Why not make it immediate rather than 90 days? Or alternatively, as banks, provide them with the products and services that they need to get paid immediately, like invoice discounting, for example, just as an example.
So Standard Bank CEO convinced that now is the time for Africa, and that's not to ignore the challenges that exist. And looming large is, of course, trade wars. But even in the trade wars, there's opportunity, and that's according to Standard Bank's chief economist, Gulam Balam. Let's take a look at what he had to say.
Despite what still is important and substantial in terms of America attempting to reframe global trade rules, the markets have seemingly been sanguine about it. What I mean by that is if you look at financial markets, it certainly isn't pricing in an enormous amount of uncertainty. Specifically, if we look at what we call financial conditions, which is really access to liquidity as well as its price, conditions have in fact eased. And that's not quite what many would have anticipated. So I'm not going to suggest there's somewhat of a financial markets yawn being shown to America's assailing of the rest of the world. It's important, but it isn't as disturbing as one would have imagined. And of course, what that has meant is it has lowered the tail risk of, say, a recession in the latter half of 2025. And of course, that again is to be cheered because it means that global growth will turn out better than anticipated. I think over the medium term to longer term, this, what we call an arc of opportunity, in a sense that firms hailing from the tip of Africa through the Middle East and into the Far East, this arc will increasingly reinforce itself commercially. In other words, they could turn out to represent firms and countries and regions, maybe even continents, that have a shared value system that subscribe to a common global framework in terms of the rules of the game, much to the dismay, I'm sure, of the United States. But effectively, we're saying that we're now functioning in a world where, over the near to medium term, citizens and statesmen realize that the U.S. has become an unpredictable partner, that the U.S. may not necessarily do justice with regard to fair and reciprocal trade. It's notable also that 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing trade corridors already exclude the United States. And I think America's actions are only going to catalyze that theme.
You talk about catalyzing perhaps or strengthening different bonds. Do you see that the BRICS grouping then looms larger potentially for us and strengthening those bonds more so than perhaps with the US?
So the BRICS grouping, and as we all now know, has evolved into a BRICS plus. But that said, it is in its nature also evolved over the last 2 decades or so. So its reason for existence, its purpose, the alliances amongst members have similarly evolved. And I think it speaks quite simply to this idea of multipolarity. It speaks to the idea that emerging markets continue to ascend in terms of economic heft, in terms of integration. And so one cannot just simply wish away the increasing dominance or, let's say, ascendancy of the global South. America is not going to deal that a death blow, for that matter. So whatever we refer to it as BRICS Plus or Global South, the notion of increasing commercial activity and ties between these nations will only strengthen in the years and decades to come. And my sense is that South Africa needs to clearly, and the continent, embrace that. But I would not at the same time discourage that we continue to attempt to enhance economic diplomacy with the United States, with the Europe, both regions. For example, the global north enjoys huge heft, very meaningful in terms of international diplomacy. And we need to find some common ground, as patchy as it may be, over the near to medium term.
We talk about common ground, and yet AGOA also looms large, and that coming to an end. Does the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, or the area, come into play here? Because some would argue that all kind of factors are leading towards just being the really most opportune moment for that agreement to come to the fore and really start working. Are you viewing it like that, or do we just have too far to go on the African Continental Free Trade Area to really make a lot of headway in, so that it's like while AGOA falls away, this area then emerges? I suppose that's probably too simplistic of a solution, but do you see what's currently happening giving impetus to this act, this area, so that Africa starts trading more so with itself than with the rest of the world?
So there's probably two ambitions for Africa with regard to trade. The one is, as you rightly suggest, increasing intra-Africa trade. And the second is for the continent to insert itself into global supply chains, African supply chains, as well as internationally. So those should be the lead motifs with regard to externalizing local economies. The free trade agreement provides us with that platform, that hope, that ambition, and that recognition. But progress has been glacial. And I would hope that given the opportunity, and there I say the necessity, to reinforce intra-Africa trade, that the economic diplomacy by various nations towards the free trade agreement can only be enhanced. But that said, my sense it's the private sector that needs to lean in. In the same way, over the last 2 decades, intra-Africa trade has doubled from around 9% of total trade, say 20 years ago, to around 18% now. It's grown, it's doubled, but the private sector, I suspect, organically can be the meaningful source of impetus going forward. The nature of this particular conference is to abet that. In other words, what we're trying to do here is, well, of course, we recognize banks, their vanilla service is to provide and intermediate financial flows between savers and borrowers. But what we also want to do is intermediate relationships amongst entrepreneurs, create an ecosystem of entrepreneurs where we can switch a light on and they get to know each other, they get to see opportunities and engage, and maybe also create an intermediation of ideas, networks of people and capital is what we're trying to aid in this, what is a business and banking Pan-African Congress.
Well, that's where we leave it for this episode of Insights from Africa. But you can, of course, find us on YouTube. If you go to the Business Day TV page and look under the Insights from Africa tab, you can watch any of our content again. And if you'd like to know what's coming up next, be sure to find us on our social media pages. You can find us on LinkedIn and TikTok as well. But for now, let's leave it there. From me, Bronwyn Seaborn, and the team here in Cape Town, it's goodbye for now. Insights from Africa is brought to you in partnership with Standard Bank.